Hello, everyone. Hope you're having a wonderful day. Today, we're diving into a heartbreaking twist. Diep goes looking for James, only to see him sitting with another girl. Then, moments later, that girl gets attacked, and everything makes it look like Diep did it. If you enjoy this story, don't forget to hit subscribe so you won't miss the next episodes. James came back late in the afternoon, when the sun was already fading over the familiar roofline he and Diep used to dream about. He stood at the door, gripping the strap of his bag so tightly his knuckles turned pale. Those long days of silence, no calls, no messages, had carved something into him. The longer it went on, the less he knew how to start. He took a deep breath and knocked. Inside, it was quiet for a few seconds. Then slow, cautious footsteps. The door opened. Diep stood there. She looked thinner, worn out, dark circles under her eyes, but her gaze was cold enough to make James feel like he'd just stepped into winter. She didn't ask, "Where have you been?" She didn't ask, "Are you okay?" She just stared at him like he was a stranger. James swallowed. His voice came out rough. "Diep, I'm back." Diep let out a short, bitter laugh. No warmth, no relief. "Back?" she said. "You say that like this is your home." James froze. Her words were sharp, but he couldn't blame her. He tried to step inside, his eyes pleading. "I know I was wrong. I had my reasons, but I'm not here to use them as an excuse. I just wanted to see you. I just wanted to tell you that..." Diep lifted her hand and stopped him, palm pressed lightly against his chest like a wall. "Don't come in. Don't say anything." James's throat tightened. "You're mad. I get it. But at least give me one chance to explain. I didn't disappear because I wanted to leave you. Diep laughed again, and somehow it hurt more than crying. "You disappeared, James. You vanished like you never even existed. Not one text. Not one call. Do you have any idea what that feels like?" James lowered his head, his hands trembling. "I know. I'm sorry." Diep stared at him. Her eyes shined, but no tears fell. She spoke slowly, clearly, like she was stamping the words into her own heart. "Sorry doesn't give me back the nights I couldn't sleep. Sorry doesn't take away the humiliation of people asking, 'Where's your CEO now?' Sorry doesn't make me feel any less stupid for believing you'd be different." James looked up, eyes red. "I never wanted you to go through any of that. I came back to make it right. I came back to..." "To what?" Diep cut in. "To tell me you were busy? That you had things to handle? Or to tell me you got held up? Forced to stay? Dragged into whatever? And I'm supposed to just understand? Just forgive? Just accept it?" James opened his mouth, but nothing came out. He stood there like someone who'd lost the ability to speak. Diep exhaled. Her voice dropped, softer, but even colder. "Go. I'm tired." James shook his head and stepped forward. "I'm not leaving. I won't abandon you again." Diep looked him straight in the eyes. "You didn't abandon me?" Her voice rose just a little. "Then what was the last few days? Or do you not even realize you left until it's too late?" James went rigid. That sentence hit like a slap. Diep turned her face away like she was afraid if she looked at him any longer, she'd break. She spoke fast, decisive. "I don't want to hear it. I don't want to see you anymore. Leave, James. Leave now." James stood still for a few seconds, waiting, hoping she'd change her mind, hoping she'd say, "I didn't mean it." But she didn't. Her shoulders were stiff, like she was forcing herself to be strong. James swallowed hard. His voice dropped to almost a whisper. "If you're pushing me away today, I'll still find a way to talk to you. I'll still..." "Go!" Diep snapped, turning back. Her eyes were red. "Please, don't make me hate you more." That please made James go numb. He understood. If he stayed, she'd shatter. And if she shattered, they'd both bleed even more. James took a step back. He looked at her for a long moment, like he wanted to carve her face into his memory. "I'll go, but I'm not giving up." Diep didn't answer. The door slammed shut, loud and final, like a clean cut. James stood outside, silent. After a moment, he turned and walked away. Every step felt heavier than the last. He made it a short distance, then stopped and looked back. But the door stayed closed. He swallowed his pain and kept walking. The second the door closed, Diep leaned back against it. Her hands were shaking. She bit down hard, trying not to cry, but her chest felt like it was being crushed. She'd waited. She'd imagined 100 times what it would be like when James finally came back, but she never imagined that when he did, her heart would already be this torn up. She slid down to the floor and covered her face. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you do this to me?" Then she remembered James's eyes, tired, raw, real in a way that confused her. "I had my reasons," he'd said. She hated that line, but she was also afraid. What if it was true? Diep jumped up. She yanked the door open and looked outside. The street was empty. Cold air rushed in. James was already gone. She stood there for a few seconds. Then something pulled her forward, and she ran. She ran in the direction he'd gone, heart pounding, head spinning. She didn't even know why she was running. Was it to stop him? To yell at him again? Or just to ask one question? Where were you? But sometimes you don't think. You just run. Because if you don't, you'll regret it. After a few streets, Diep slowed down, breathing hard. She looked around. The crowd was thin. And then, as she passed by a cafe, she glanced inside without even meaning to. That glance stopped her cold. James was sitting there, and across from him sat another girl. Diep froze. The blood drained from her face. She saw James lean in to listen to whatever the girl was saying. She saw the girl lift her hand, resting it near his on the table, an easy, familiar kind of gesture. James wasn't laughing, but his face wasn't as tense as it had been at Diep's door. Diep couldn't hear their words. She only saw the picture. James, the man who had just said, "I'm back," sitting with someone else. Her throat tightened. Her ears rang. One cruel thought flashed through her mind. So that's where you were, with her. Diep stepped back. Then another step. Her eyes burned, but she bit her lip hard, forcing herself not to cry. In front of all these people, she refused to fall apart. She turned and walked away fast. Every step felt like she was stepping on her own pride. But after only a few yards, she heard a chair scrape back, hard. Then a voice, panicked, "Diep!" She didn't turn around. She walked faster. "Diep, wait!" James called louder, his voice breaking. Diep was almost running now, her heart hammered, pain and anger tangled together. Behind her, she heard James's footsteps chasing her, heard his breath, ragged, but she didn't want to face him. She didn't want to hear one more explanation. She cut quickly into a narrow passage beside the cafe and slipped into a hidden corner between two walls, holding her breath. Her heart was beating so loud she swore James could hear it. James's footsteps rushed past. "Diep!" he shouted again, his voice raw. Diep hugged her chest and clamped her mouth shut. One hot tear slid down her cheek. Through a small crack, she watched James stop and look around, frantic, almost desperate. Then his footsteps faded. Diep slid down into the shadows and sat on the ground, shaking. She breathed in short bursts, her vision blurring. Out there, James didn't find her. Diep stayed curled up in that hidden corner for a long time, until the noise on the street returned to normal and her heartbeat stopped pounding like it was about to burst. She wiped the tears off her cheek with the back of her hand, mad at herself for running after him, and even angrier for not having the courage to step out and face him. "That's it," she told herself, her voice shaking even as she tried to sound tough. "It's over. It's really over." She stood up, straightened her clothes, took a deep breath to steady herself, and stepped out of the narrow passage. No one paid attention to her. The cafe was still bright. People were still talking and laughing, and she felt like she'd just walked out of a storm. Diep didn't look back. She just wanted to get away from that place as fast as possible. But after only a few steps, she heard the cafe door open behind her, chairs scraping, footsteps she knew too well. She didn't even have to turn around to know who it was. James. Diep immediately turned down a different path and walked faster, trying to blend into the crowd. She was terrified that if James saw her again, she wouldn't be able to hold it together. She was scared she'd cry. Or worse, she'd ask questions she wasn't ready to hear the answers to. Behind her, the footsteps hesitated, and then stopped. Maybe James had given up chasing, or maybe he just couldn't see her anymore. Diep let out a shaky breath, her chest still aching. She walked a little farther, then stopped under a tree, head down, eyes blurring. She didn't even know what she was more disappointed about: James sitting with that girl, or the fact that she hadn't been brave enough to step forward and ask one clear question. Inside the cafe, James stood by the entrance, his eyes scanning the street one more time, like someone who'd just lost the most important thing in his life. His hands clenched tight. The panic in his chest hadn't even faded yet when a voice behind him pulled him back. "James?" He turned. The girl he'd been sitting with looked at him, surprised and confused. She didn't know what had just happened, only that James had suddenly jumped up and rushed outside like something terrible had occurred. James took a breath and forced himself to calm down. He didn't want to drag her into any of this. He walked back to the table, voice low. "I'm sorry. Something came up." The girl studied him for a moment, then nodded like she understood. She didn't press him, just spoke gently. "It's okay. If you need to go, then go." James stood there for a beat, his eyes darkening. He didn't say much. He just gave a small nod, half thank you, half apology. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I'm heading out." He turned and walked out of the cafe again. This time, he didn't run. He walked fast, jaw tight, like he was forcing himself to stay calm enough to think straight. Across the street, Diep was still tucked into the shadow under the tree, watching everything like she was looking through fog. And then she saw James go back into the cafe. Diep froze. He went back. Why? The thought flashed through her mind. Then she saw James pause at the door and say something to the girl. It was quick, a short exchange, a small nod. And then James walked out and left. Diep watched his back as he walked away. In that moment, something cold washed over her, like she'd just watched James make his choice. And only after that did he leave. And she, the one who had waited for him, wasn't the one he chose. Diep turned away fast. She couldn't stand to look anymore. She hurried down a small alley, her hands clenched so tight her knuckles went white. She didn't even know where she was going. She only knew she needed to get as far away from that cafe as possible, but her mind wouldn't stop replaying what she'd seen. James sitting across from that girl, looking calm, while in front of Diep, he'd looked exhausted and broken. She couldn't tell what was real anymore. She didn't know which version of his face to believe. James, after leaving the cafe, walked a few steps, then stopped. He turned back, like something still didn't sit right. He knew what he'd seen earlier. That was Diep. There was no way he'd mistaken her. But why did she run? Why didn't she call out to him? Why did she hide? He rubbed his forehead, breathing heavy. Part of him wanted to turn around and look for her again, until his feet felt stuck by that helpless thought. If I push her one more time, she'll hurt even more. And in her eyes, I'll only become someone she hates. James stood there for another second. Then finally he turned and walked away. Right then, the cafe door behind him opened again. The girl stepped outside. She had just reached the steps, still looking down at her phone, when a figure rushed in fast from the side of the cafe. Diep didn't see it. James didn't see it. All anyone heard was a dull, sickening thud in the night, like skin and bone meeting force. The girl jerked back with a choked cry. Her phone hit the ground. She stumbled, lifting a hand to her face. Who did that?" But the figure had already slipped backward into the darkness, vanishing like they'd never been there. The girl's breathing came quick and panicked. She whipped her head around toward the cafe entrance like she wanted to scream for help, then looked out at the street. People farther away kept walking, kept chatting, totally unaware something had just happened right here. Her hands trembling, she bent down and grabbed her phone. When she looked up, her eyes locked on the mouth of the alley, where there was a patch of shadow, just deep enough for someone to hide. In that darkness, there was a silhouette standing still, small, slim, hair tied back. It looked exactly like Diep. The girl froze, her face draining of color. It was like she wanted to say a name but couldn't make her throat work. Farther down the street, James flinched at the sound. He turned around on instinct, but it was too far. The lights were too dim. All he could make out was someone near the cafe swaying and holding their face, and a shadow disappearing into the dark. James's brows pulled together, his heart thumping hard. And Diep, if it really was Diep, didn't move in that hidden corner. She stood there like a statue. No one knew who threw the punch. They only knew that from the way it looked, from the angle, from the timing, from the shadows. Everything pointed in one direction: Diep. And right then, the girl lifted her head, eyes wide, staring into the darkness like she wanted to believe it wasn't true, but couldn't. That hit didn't just hurt her. It opened a brand new misunderstanding, big enough to push everyone even farther apart. After days of silence, James finally returns, hoping to explain everything, but Diep is too hurt to listen. Feeling abandoned and humiliated, she forces him to leave, even though it breaks her inside. Moments later, regret takes over and she runs after him. Outside a cafe, Diep freezes when she sees James sitting across from another girl. Misreading the scene, she quietly backs away, crushed and disappointed. James spots her, rushes after her, but Diep hides in a dark corner and slips away before he can reach her. James returns to the cafe, politely says goodbye to the girl, and leaves. Right after, the girl steps outside and is suddenly attacked by someone in the shadows. In the confusion, a figure resembling Diep is seen nearby, setting up a dangerous misunderstanding.